Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum. Please excuse the hoarse voice. I've got a bit of congestion going on here. Today, I want to take a look at the U.S. Marine Corps use of the Johnson model of 1941 rifle. These rifles went into production, well, let me start with the fact that these rifles competed against the M1 Garand, but only after the Garand had essentially already been adopted. U.S. military testing found the Johnson rifle to be effective and reliable and pretty much equivalent to the M1, but because the M1 was already in production and up and running, the Johnson essentially was rejected for U.S. military adoption. Essentially, it wasn't better than the M1 Garand in any substantial way, and we don't need two different rifles. However, the U.S. Marine Corps was sort of a late adopter of the M1 Garand, and they did more testing of the Johnson later than the Army did. At the same time, the U.S. Marine Corps was setting up some new units, in particular paramarines, Marine paratroopers. Starting in late 1940, they start developing a program for Marine paratroopers. And the Johnson rifle and also the Johnson light machine gun were particularly appealing to Marine paratroopers because they have a quick removable barrel, which allows this full-length rifle to be split into two pieces that are both a bit shorter and more conducive to strapping onto a leg bag or otherwise carrying on a parachute drop. Now, the Paramarines, the 1st Marine Parachute Regiment, would end up adopting the Johnson light machine gun and the Rising M55 submachine gun. That's a 45 caliber closed bolt submachine gun with a really tragically bad wire folding stock on it. It was very compact, but the stock was otherwise terrible. Now, I have videos on both of those guns. I'll link to them at the end here. But Johnson rifles went into production for the Dutch Purchasing Commission. The Dutch wanted these guns. The Dutch were looking for basically any guns that they could get to reinforce the KNIL, the Dutch East India Army. And Johnsons were available because the U.S. military had declined to put them into production. So the Dutch order tens of thousands of Johnson rifles. The guns are produced, but before they can really be shipped in any significant number, the Japanese complete their conquest of the Dutch islands of the South Pacific. And so the Dutch are left with a bunch of these guns essentially sitting on the docks in the US with nowhere to go and nothing that can be done with them. Now, the Dutch would sell a lot of their Johnson light machine guns to the US Marine Corps, and they would eventually sell a total of about 750 Johnson rifles to the U.S. Marine Corps. And again, this is for the Paramarines. Now, the 1st Marine Parachute Regiment was actually part of the landing on Guadalcanal and Gavutu in particular. And those guys carried with them, they had adopted the M55 Rising, but they had 23 Johnson rifles that were basically just a loan from Melvin Johnson, the designer. It eventually turned into a gift. The guns were never returned, but he sent a few out there. And they were reportedly quite successful. The firepower that a semi-automatic rifle offered was very much appreciated by the Marines. At this point, the Marines are still using the 1903 Springfield bolt-action rifle as their standard infantry arm. And reports back from the early Solomons campaign are quite good for the Johnson rifles and the Johnson light machine guns. Now, in April of '43, the 2nd Marine Parachute Regiment is put together, and their table of organization and equipment, their TO&E, specifies Johnson light machine guns and Johnson rifles. At the same time, when the 1st Marine Parachute Regiment comes back off of Guadalcanal and does some refitting and re-equipping, they hadn't been very happy with the performance of their Rising submachine guns, and so they replaced them with Johnson semi-automatic rifles to go along with their Johnson light machine guns. So in the end, we have 2 Marine Parachute Regiments that were equipped formally with Johnson rifles. This gives us a total of about 500 guns total in service, maybe 550. The Marine Corps, like I said, bought about 750 all in. Some of them, I believe, went to the 3rd Marine Parachute Regiment as well, and some were just spares and extras, that sort of thing. But these actually saw combat service in the Pacific. In particular, the 2nd Paramarine Regiment would go on to fight in the Solomons as well. They took Choiseul Island in late October to early November of '43. They then fought on Bougainville with Johnson rifles and light machine guns, and again, reports were quite positive. By the end of the Bougainville campaign, however, the Marine Corps was really questioning the need for parachute troops and other Marine elite units like the Raiders. And so a lot of these units would be disbanded. Now, before we talk about where these rifles all went, one of the things that the first Paramarines in particular did was modify the sights on them. So let's take a closer look at that. As originally designed, the Johnson had a rear aperture sight. This dial adjusts windage, and then you kind of have sort of a commercial style of rear sight here where you lift up and slide this ladder back and forth to set range. This was originally flat across the top and had this small aperture hole in the center of it. What a lot of the Marines, in particular in the 1st Paramarine Regiment, did was make some modifications to this to actually make it resemble a bit more like a 1903 Springfield sight. So some of them would cut the rear sight off right at that aperture hole, so they had essentially a U-notch. Some of them cut a deep V, so they had almost more like a buckhorn style of rear sight. That was coupled with cutting off the front sight protector wings. So originally, there were 2 vertical wings on either side of the front sight blade to protect it. And what, again, a lot of the Marines did, this was done by armorers in the field, as best we can tell, was actually cut off those wings. So in this case, they cut the wings off and then sort of rounded them down. Some of them, the wings are cut off and just, there's like a flat remnant of where the protector wing used to be. But you can see that this, without those wings, this is actually pretty similar to the look of a 1903 Springfield front sight. And it's worth pointing out that the 1903 Springfield is what the Marines had primarily trained with. That's what the Marine Corps in general was using at the beginning of World War II. So the Johnson sight picture was a little bit unfamiliar to them, and they liked the idea of modifying it to match what they were used to. While we are here, I think it's also worth pointing out the quick barrel release feature of the Johnson, because that's what made it particularly appealing to the Paramarines. So there's a hole in the side of the front of the stock here with a little spring-loaded button, and I push that button in and it will essentially release this spring latch here. So you would normally do that with a cartridge. Just have a screwdriver here that I'm going to poke it with, and when I punch this in, you can see that that is going to come out just slightly. I'm going to unlock the bolt from the barrel, so I'll lock the bolt to the rear. And then we can lift this catch out, and the barrel just pulls right out. There we go. So now you have a substantially shorter rifle, and the barrel you can pack alongside it. This still isn't the world's best, quick takedown compact rifle. There was actually some experimentation with a paratrooper version of the 1941 that had a release button here and a detachable rear stock that essentially let you take the rifle down into 3 pieces that were all about the same length, but that never got past the experiment or prototype stage. So this is the standard Johnson. This is how they all work, and that is what made it particularly interesting to the Paramarines, despite the fact that the Paramarines would never actually go on to do a combat paratroop drop during World War II. In February of 1944, the 2nd Paramarine Regiment is officially disbanded, and they leave most of their weapons on Bougainville. There are reports from some of the Paramarines that they were ordered to just bury the guns, the Johnson rifles and light machine guns, on the beaches on Bougainville. Of course, by this point in the war, early 44, U.S. small arms production is just huge in scale. The M1 is the standard rifle. The Marine Corps have adopted it, long since adopted it by this point. The Johnson guns really don't have any place in the U.S. military logistics trail at that point. We have lots of 1919s, we have lots of BARs. The Johnson light machine guns are sort of the awkward stepchild. They were never adopted by any other service. They were never really used by anyone outside of the Marine paratroops. And so it makes sense for the Marines to just essentially write off all of these guns. Now it's interesting that Johnson Automatics, the company, Melvin Johnson, actually purchased 100 Johnson rifles back from the Marine Corps in 1945. So not all of these were destroyed, and most of our surviving Marine Corps Johnson rifles come from that repurchase by Johnson. He bought those rifles up, and then resold them on the commercial market shortly thereafter, after the war. So a few of these were, and a few of the light machine guns were sort of covertly sent back to the US by soldiers who carried them. It wasn't really allowed, but some guys did it anyway. I don't have any specific provenance to this, but the sight modifications, if we go by Bruce Canfield's book, he is the definitive author on this subject, these sight modifications are primarily attributed to the 1st Paramarine Regiment. So it's really cool to get a chance to take a look at one of the Johnsons that did actually see Marine Corps combat service. They're a very scarce gun today, and I think they're a really cool and underappreciated part of US military weapons history. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.